All right, PreCalc, this is a moment you guys have been waiting for. Since 8th grade, you've been seeing my trig art on my wall, and you've said, when do we do that? Well, here we are. We are in lesson 4.5. We are sketching graphs of sine and cosine. There is so much information here, so we're going to take it nice and slowly. Our essential question is asking us all the different things we're going to do. Can you sketch graphs of basic sine and cosine functions? Do you know what amplitude is? Do you know what period is? And can you sketch the graphs using this information? Now, one thing that we do have to understand is that the range, because we're at a unit circle, is only from -1 to +1. Now, that will change with amplitude, and we'll talk about that. But what we need to know is that the graph of sine starts on 0. It hits 1 at that 90-degree angle, pi/2. Remember, we're just looking at the y. We come back to 0 at pi. We go down to -1 at 3pi/2. And right back at 2 pi, we're completing the unit circle and we're at 0. So remember, 1 period is 1 rotation, and this is 2 pi. Now, obviously, this graph can go on, and I've showed that this graph can go on. We could stop the graph, but this is a really cool looking graph, and the graph of sine always starts on 0, because you have to think at 0 or 2 pi, the sine, which is the y, starts at 0. All right, so let's go ahead and look at cosine. Cosine, again, the range is from -1 to +1, which is going to change with amplitude. But remember, at 0, 2 pi, the x is 1. So this one's going to start at 1. It's going to go down to 0 at -pi/2, down to -1 at pi, 3 pi/2, it revisits 0, and 2 pi, it's back at 1. So remember, 1 period is from 0 to 2 pi. And we can continue on with this graph just like we continued on with the sine. So they're pretty easy to remember because they hit each spot of the unit circle at the what we call non-angle angles. And we start with the sine on y, which is 0. We start with the cosine on x, which is 1. They do give us these key points for sine and cosine. When the x is at these places, 0, pi/6, pi/4, pi/3, pi/2, 3 pi/4, pi, 3/2, and 2 pi. They show us where the sine and the cosine will be. Now, you probably already know this because you've had to memorize the unit circle, but it's good to just know and recognize of what's happening here. Okay, this is a great chart. Do I have to memorize this chart? No, because you know the left-hand trick. There's a lot of other things that you know about this. So cosine is going to put us all right here. So take a good look at that. Again, these are some key points for sine and cosine when we're graphing the unit circle. All right, so let's dig in. All right, so for example 1, they're giving us this function that says y is equal to 3 times the cosine of x. The first thing we have to recognize, and this is a new term for us, is 3 is going to be called the amplitude. So this changes everything. Instead of going up to 1, we're going to go up to 3. And they're telling us to graph this on the interval of -pi/2 and 9 pi/2. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to draw my graph. And I always draw out the points that we know. We know pi/2, pi, 3 pi/2, 2 pi. Well, if this is 1 pi/2, 3 pi/2, this is 5 pi/2, and 1 pi, 2 pi, this is 3 pi. Well, it looks like they want us to keep graphing, so I'm going to draw my graph a little further. 7 pi/2, 4 pi. And here we go. This is where we need to go to, 9 pi over 2. And remember, they wanted us to start at negative pi over 2. Because the amplitude is 3, instead of starting on, I'm going to draw this first what you know. So instead of starting on 1 for the cosine, I'm going to start at 3. Then it's going to go down to 0, down to negative 3, up to 0, up to 3. Now, because I have to continue this graph, I know this is what it's going to look like. Okay, but I'm going to fill in my dots first. I like to go ahead and put the markers there so I can see. And notice when it ends at 9 pi over 2, it's going to be right there. Notice these are not sharp curves. So when you draw it on your trig art, try not to make it sharp. They should be smooth, rounded curves. Some of mine are a little shaky, so let me fix them. But I will be knocking points off if you graph this on a test or a quiz with sharp curves, like a V. All right, so there is the graph of y equals 3 times the cosine of x. And they asked us to graph it on the interval from negative pi over 2 all the way to 9 pi over 2. Well, we talked a little bit about amplitude, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the definition of amplitude of sine and cosine curves. Amplitude is y equals a sine of x, y equals a cosine of x. And notice it represents half the distance between the maximum and the minimum. And notice that that amplitude is always going to be an absolute value. So I'll never say if it's a negative 3, we start down instead of up. I would never say that the amplitude is negative 3. I would say that it's 3 because it is a distance. So we want to know that amplitude is a distance. Whoops, meant to change that to a pen. So if I was to talk about the amplitude in example 1, notice the amplitude was 3, and that is a distance. Okay, if it was a negative 3, we would have started down here. And that's how you make this pretty graph for your trig art. Some people really like this look, thinks it looks like clouds and stuff. So a negative 3 would start down instead of up.